task today is threefold. One, I'd like to describe the current landscape, kind of tell you where we've been. And the second one is we're going to take a quick run through the emerging issues and trends, kind of take a forward-looking look where we're going. And the final one, which I think is the most difficult. Thank you. And I look forward to interacting with you and learning from the collective wisdom of this group, our strategy thoughts going forward. How do we win? Because right now, the track record in the States has not been a good one. I'll explain. What's the landscape today in the States? I would maintain that it's more than just animal welfare. I think each and every one of us in this room is concerned with animal welfare. No exceptions. This is a fundamental effort to reshape animal agriculture as we know it. And these groups that are pushing this agenda seek to change the traditional methods of raising animals today. That is no secret to anyone in this room. How have they done this? For years, the groups were unable to move their agenda forward in legislatures. However, a few years ago, there was a paradigm shift, and people figured out there's a way to do this, primarily through a mix of ballot initiatives and legislation, or really the threat of both of those things, have been able to move the agenda forward. Now, today, I've got a limited amount of time. I'm going to constrain my comments to those two areas. I'm not going to talk about the new regulations that are proliferating out there. Mr. Putzi works on that in Iowa all the time. You know, zoning, siting, all types of things that make it difficult to site an operation. Executive orders that are issued by governors and others. Judicial challenges seem to be everywhere. And finally, the retail and consumer protests. These are all things that complete the mosaic of what we're facing out there. And I think a number of speakers that we'll hear over the next day or two will comment on those particular aspects. What's it look like today? The level of animal welfare activity in the States is unprecedented. I counted 67 bills alone in over half the states. Now you're probably looking at this and say, hey, I got a state that isn't covered here. You know, we could go back and look at last year. There were 100 different pieces of legislation that moved. There were ballot initiatives from previous years that still aren't enacted but are in the process. If we were to go back a few years, I think we could fill in virtually every state. And that's one of the key conclusions, is that no state is immune from this kind of activity. The bills are wide-ranging. They're all over the place, from tail docking to animal cruelty, housing requirements, care boards, standards of care. The list goes on. This is a little chart of kind of what's happened over the few years, and I'm going to confine myself to kind of housing requirements here. This whole initiative started in 2002 in Florida, and there was an effort to place it on the ballot, what we call initiative and referendum, where a group can take an issue directly to the voters, bypass the traditional legislative process, and put it on the ballot. And I think a lot of people looked at it. There's not a lot of hogs in Florida, and it kind of sailed through without much challenge. That was 2002. That's only 8 years ago. A few years later, 2006, Arizona, same thing. Looked at banning veal crates and gestation stalls. Not a lot of veal in Arizona, and I think there's only one significant pork producer in Arizona in one spot. Pretty limited. Again, the relative stakes were not that great. I think $1.2 million or something like that was spent on that challenge, and it sailed through, 62-38. Fast forward another year or two, you got Oregon and Colorado. Both said, hey, we don't have the resources, we don't have the expertise, we're not going to take on a ballot initiative, we're going to negotiate and pass legislation. Again, 2007, Oregon was the first state. 2008, Colorado followed suit. Then, 2008. This is, I would submit to you, the deal changer. California, on the ballot, it has a history of ballot initiatives. Prop 2, an effort to ban gestation, veal, and battery cages in the state. I think everyone knows about this issue. $10 million, from just a few years, from 1.2 to about $10 million was spent. Look at the result, 63-37. That is a resounding defeat on that issue. Maine, Michigan followed suit, said, we can't undertake a big campaign like that. We're just going to negotiate a deal. In Michigan, for example, HSUS comes to the state, they talk to the Farm Bureau and say, hey, work with us, give us some legislation, or we will pursue a ballot initiative, much like we've done in other states. So they looked at it and said, we really can't do it. We're going to negotiate a deal, which they did. So you've got basically a 10-year phase-out. You've got a role for the Department of Agriculture and a few other provisions. Ohio, which was also confronted with the same problem, took a different tack and said, we don't like this. We got a group coming into the state trying to tell us how to raise animals. So quietly, the Farm Bureau and the others in the Ag Coalition worked with legislative leadership. Now, this was a bipartisan effort. Democrats, Republicans, Governor, House, Senate. And they proposed their own ballot initiative that would say, hey, we don't want to deal with this type of legislation. We want to create our own livestock care board. And that's what they did. They passed it, spent almost $5 million, and it passed 64-36, which was a resounding victory. However, HSUS, what's that? No. Oh, sorry. HSUS really never challenged that. So that was a victory, but HSUS, almost within 24 hours, came back and said, you know what? We're going to challenge that. And that is exactly what they're doing today. They are in the process of collecting signatures right now, about 400,000 signatures which are needed to place a new issue on the ballot. And what they propose doing is to create California-like standards in Ohio, phasing out battery cages, gestation stalls, and they're going to do it in 6 years. Not the 10-year phase-in or phase-out, shall we say, that Michigan had, but they're going to do that. Missouri, there's also a puppy mill ballot initiative, which I understand is polling quite well. And there, the state's relatively smaller. You only have to collect about 100,000 signatures. I understand in both states that the signature collection process is going slower than what we would anticipate. Roughly 25% of the signatures have been collected, and but nobody doubts that those signatures will be collected. So, like I said, in Ohio, they're collecting the signatures. They need to collect 402,000 signatures from 44 counties, so it's widespread. That's going on right now. The other thing to look, when you go back to this, look at the margin of victory. In each and every case, the margin of victory was resounding. That, my friends, is the challenge that we face as an industry as we confront these challenges. When we look back at these states, what do they have in common? Those states are all over, from Florida to Arizona to California. Really, what do they have in common? They've got organized grassroots. States like this have a tradition of this type of activism, but the number one issue is the ballot petitions that these states allow for constitutional amendment and initiated statutes. Who in this room knows about the initiated process, ballots initiatives? Who's heard about this? Relatively few. I would say a year ago there were even fewer. Here's what we got. These states, if you look at these states that are in green and blue, these are states that allow initiative and referendum. That is, you can place an issue on the ballot, so when the voters come to the ballot box in November, they can vote on a particular issue. HSUS and the other animal welfare groups have figured this out. They have been unable to move their agenda through the legislature. But by collecting the signatures and going directly to the people and by using whatever language they choose to introduce the issue, they can tee this issue up. And that is exactly what happened in each and every one of those 7 states. Take a look at this. If you look at where HSUS has been active, look at the red dots. They're basically picking the states that have the constitutional amendment process. And they figured that out in 2002, 6 years ago. They started with the states down in Florida, Arizona, worked around to the west coast, and then you've got the east coast. I mentioned Michigan and Ohio, which were last year. And then the yellow dots, which are states that we've identified as states that are perhaps next in line. The interesting thing to note is that the states that are now the prime targets for this type of activity are in the agricultural Midwest. They're not peripheral states. They're states that are the heart and soul of livestock. And that's what we're seeing right now. Again, a couple thoughts on these states. I think the number one state, if anyone's keeping score at home, is Ohio. I think if you watch Ohio and you see how that process plays out, I think that is fundamental to where this debate goes. That is a bellwether state. And keep in mind, everywhere that HSUS has placed this on the ballot, they've won. They are batting 1,000%. 100%. They are, and that is the key state. The other thing in Ohio, instead of a 10-year phase-in like Michigan negotiated, they're talking about 6 years. They're talking about treatments of euthanasia, transportation, other requirements. And the Livestock Care Board has been approved by the governor at the end of March. It's up and running. I believe in May they will have a series of hearings around the state. 13 people have been appointed to the board, including 4 veterinarians, a member of a humane society in state, and a number of representatives from across other groups. Ohioans, is anyone from Ohio here? There we go. The main argument is, let's let Ohioans set the standards. Let's give the board a chance to operate. However, even before they can get up and running, HSUS and others are collecting the signatures to mandate minimum standards. The other state we're looking at is Missouri. I think I mentioned collecting signatures, about 100,000. This is puppy mill only. But if you look at the language, it talks about housing requirements. It talks about rest between breeding cycles and all other kinds of mandates that you can see it's perhaps a dry run for 2 years out for another ballot initiative. California. Again, just because a state passes an activity or passes an initiative doesn't mean that the battle stops there. It continues incrementally. Every year there are additional requirements that are being imposed on the industry. There's one bill that would apply Prop 2 standards for all eggs that are imported into the state. There's also a bill that would create a registry for animal abusers. The point is, just because a battle has been lost, an issue has been passed, does not mean that it stops there. And California really is a state to keep in mind. And Oklahoma. Oklahoma, as you may recall from a previous slide, is a ballot state. Why Oklahoma? It seems to me to be a pretty rural state, but if you look at the demographics, roughly 40 and trending up % of the population live in 2 urban areas, Tulsa and Oklahoma City. It's a major producer of hogs that get finished in other parts of the state, and I think you look at the ballot requirements, it doesn't take a lot of signatures to put something on the ballot. So again, that would be a state that I would keep on your radar list. Other states, Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, New York, Minnesota, with the exception of New York, they are all Midwestern states. And I think a few years ago, we would have thought that it was perhaps unassailable, that these states would not be the targets of this type of activity. I think that's changed. And the other conclusion that I would throw out is that every state is vulnerable. And before it used to be seen as, hey, that's another state's problem. I think it's a collective problem. And I think that the recognition of that has increased in just a few short years. What's been the response from the egg groups? I think a lot of people look to Ohio and say, hey, they created a livestock care board. Perhaps we should create a livestock care board in our own state. That may be something we could look at. And several states are looking at it. I think Kentucky just passed legislation that would do the same thing. Missouri, also looking at it. However, I don't think they wanted to go there. They're looking at, there's a bill right now that would create an advisory board only. But I know a number of groups have said, hey, if we create a livestock care board, then what? What are the standards? Who defines the standards? You've got a body that's inherently political. What happens if you have a change of administration and new appointments? Is this susceptible to some kind of political chicanery? And I think there are all kinds of concerns about that, so some states are stepping back. Indiana is another case where there's an animal health commission, and they rechartered that to add animal welfare to part of its charge. There are other states that are trying to separate companion animals from farm animals. The bottom line to this is states are beginning to become proactive. And I would maintain that if states sit back and do nothing, they will lose. Because one of the lessons that we've seen from all the states is whoever defines the issue first wins. And if you can define the issue on your terms, you will be much more successful. Where's all this leading? I believe that the goal, the end game of this whole thing, the state by state, the laboratories of democracy, is a federal legislation. If you look at the states that have passed legislation already, and you add up the number of electoral votes, the number of representatives that are covered in that, roughly 40% of the House. Representatives from states that have passed these initiatives come from these states. If they are successful and keep moving this agenda forward, let's say they have another 3-year run like they had the past 3, you'll be over 50%. And what happens when you have a kind of a network of different standards across the state? There will be calls, I believe, for harmonization. And at the end of the day, pressure will mount, as we've seen in all other aspects of legislation, that will push for some kind of federal solution. And I really believe that that is part of the agenda that's playing out. You heard Congressman speak earlier about the other issues that are playing out, certainly antibiotics, food safety. Those are really issues that are playing out at the federal level. The types of bans on housing requirements really hasn't caught a lot of traction in D.C. But as these things continue to go, that may change. What are some of the lessons learned? And again, this gets to the hard part of the presentation, and that's where I really welcome this kind of interaction. I hate to say it, but one thing that is clear is that industry really has been quite slow to respond to these challenges. One of the positives that I take away from this in the past 2 years is that it's on everyone's radar screen now. We know that there's a problem, we know there's a challenge, and we know we have to do something about it. Even states that do not have the ballot initiative, the 24 states that have ballot initiatives, even those states that don't realize that we've got some issues. Our messaging, the messaging from the activists is very clear, very succinct, and very targeted. Our messages need to be better honed. The argument that we have science-based standards that we can rely on, they might be good, they might be sound, but they're not convincing to the public. And I think when we communicate, I've heard it said, we need values-based communication that is attached to those standards. It's clear that states that have initiatives, the ballot initiative and referendum, they have a different set of options than what other states that don't. We need to be creative. We need to think outside the box. States need to be organized. It's not just enough to come together and coalesce a coalition and try to defeat legislation and go home and claim success. This is a long-term battle. Maybe not legislative, especially if they go the initiative and referendum route, but it is certainly political, and it will be protracted, and it will keep coming back year after year after year. Groups need to stay united. That sounds rather routine, but when you get out into the states and you see these groups trying to work together, ironically, we have the same end game, the same goal, but it is hard for each of us to kind of check our own parochial interests and work for the common good. It's been a challenge in a lot of states, and I think you may know what I'm talking about. But again, it's something we need to work. The old tactics no longer work. We've got to start thinking about new ways to do this. We're getting beat, 7 states, by a relatively healthy margin. That's not good. The other thing that I would point out is that finances, resources are the key to this battle as they are in most battles. And you look at the resources that are being spent by the activists, it is staggering. Next steps. Certainly we support a strategy for dealing with this state by state, working with the groups, aligning the supply chain, getting everyone involved. We would advocate staying away from the federal legislation. We think this is something that states can win, we can get it figured out, and we can move this agenda forward. We have encouraged trade associations to be aligned and to act accordingly. I think Sarah made a great point. We need to think about non-traditional actors. If we're just the agriculture groups alone, that's not good. We need to broaden it to the various ethnic groups, the business groups, all kinds of coalitions that are out there. And certainly that's the winning recipe. This is it's bipartisan. This affects all of us, and certainly this is important to the vitality of a lot of states' economic well-being, and certainly we need to do what we can to encourage that. Certainly we as a company, we've been a catalyst for change. We have 2 other folks from Cargill here, Mike Laughlin, who's a leader of our animal nutrition business, and Mike Siemens, many of you may know him, who's a leader in our animal husbandry and welfare efforts, have been very instrumental in getting involved in groups like the Coalition for Sustainable Egg Supply and the North America Food Animal Wellbeing Commission. These are groups that are getting together and looking for ways to positively move the agenda forward. We will do what we can to be a leader in this area, and we are working with groups to do that. Again, these are steps that we're taking, and certainly I look forward to interacting with you throughout the course of the next day or two, and really learning and finding ways to share information. It's easy to describe the problem. It's easy to explain kind of what's happened and maybe looking ahead where it's going. But to get these disparate groups together and really focus on what are some things we can do together, what are the solutions, that is the only way that we're going to be able to stand up to this threat.